Misery, misery, misery. That's what you've chosen.
Howdy there, friends, family, adversaries, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary folks. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Riley Constantine, aka Biological Riley, and today we are reviewing The Last of Us Part 2, which is Naughty Dog's newly released video game that follows the 2013 classic, The Last of Us, the first one, if you couldn't tell. Before we get started with the review, I need to go over some ground rules in regards to spoilers. The Last of Us Part 2 is nearly impossible to really talk about in a meaningful way without addressing some things that will ruin the plot for some people. And this is a very comprehensive review, so this is gonna cover about everything that I liked or disliked about the game. But just so you know, I will divvy up this video into two sections of non-spoiler and spoiler. It's just so you can make your own informed decision of when to opt out. And with that, on to the video. Did The Last of Us really need a sequel? Back when I completed this post-apocalyptic zombie title in 2013, I was convinced that I experienced a near-perfect action horror game that had intense pulse-pounding gameplay with an equally nerve-wracking, grim, yet sincere story with likable three-dimensional characters such as the main protagonist and the middle-aged, violent Joel Miller, and his teenage, somewhat closeted lesbian companion Ellie, who together form a father-to-adopted daughter bond amidst a world undergoing brutal societal and moral collapse. It's one of my absolute all-time favorite games where the narrative and thematic beats complement the gameplay, which in terms of The Last of Us means a riveting stealth action horror experience that accurately reflects its depressing post-apocalyptic zombie setting. To explain why The Last of Us, the first one, is such a damn good video game, let me just go through what happens in that game, because that's kind of important for understanding where we're gonna go for The Last of Us Part 2. The first The Last of Us is a gut punch. While the game exists within the dead and tired zombie apocalypse genre, The Last of Us breathed new life into this undead genre by depicting the decline of human civilization via zombie in cold and unflinching detail, with gameplay that allows the player to explore this vicious, cruel, and violent world. However, the character of Joel, no relation by the way, is not a stand-in avatar for the player. Joel is his own person with his own motivations, and players are along for the ride whether they agree with his actions or not. In a prologue section, Joel's daughter Sarah is shot and killed on the very first night of the outbreak by a government special operative who was ordered to kill survivors in an attempt to contain the spread of the virus. And when the game proper starts 20 years later, Joel has never forgiven humanity for killing his daughter. As a result, he, and by extension the player, commit terrible actions that cross moral and ethical boundaries, lest any human adversaries do the same to Joel. The post-apocalyptic America presented in The Last of Us is a lawless kill or be killed world, and Joel's merciless demeanor reflects that. Of course, things do change for Joel. Enter Ellie, a child that could pass as a clone of Ellen Page, who worms her way into Joel's heart. See, Ellie is the only person known that is immune to infection from the virus, and Joel must smuggle her to the Fireflies, no relation, who are a freedom-fighting organization that wants to give hope and a future to humanity and use Ellie's immunity to make a vaccine. Admittedly, Joel and Ellie don't get along at first, but after going through some tough shit and some heartwarming moments together, the two begin to bond. In fact, Joel views her like he does his deceased daughter. However, this becomes a problem. Once arriving at the facility run by the Fireflies, we discover a twist. The procedure needed to make a vaccine would kill Ellie, and rather than sacrificing her, Joel couldn't bear to lose another daughter all over again. While Ellie is on the operating table, Joel goes on a rampage faster than you can say it's Miller time, murdering any Firefly that gets in his way, as well as the doctor operating on Ellie, and eventually the Fireflies' leader. When Ellie wakes up, Joel lies, claiming that the Fireflies were unable to make a vaccine and let Joel and Ellie go on their merry way. Yet Ellie has some doubt. And that is where the game closes. It's a poetic, tragic, and stunning conclusion to a game that hits you in the gut. Joel's love saves Ellie, but dooms humanity. Yeah, the ending is basically perfect, and you just have to wonder, how do you follow up from that? With The Last of Us Part 2, I was curious to learn how Naughty Dog would approach the follow-up to a game with such a good ending that it didn't necessarily need a sequel. And to answer, Naughty Dog created a very divisive game in The Last of Us Part 2. Sure, numerous critics loved the game, one even comparing the game to Schindler's List for some reason. Please don't compare AAA big budget games to Schindler's List. That's just gauche. That's not that's No! So yeah, many critics loved The Last of Us Part 2, yet some fans of the first game are less enthused. Many have taken over Metacritic's user review page posting, reviews, and some professional critics were miffed by the game as well for more logical reasons, one even stating that when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2, we are better than this. Well, I'm not, so it goes without saying that I was excited to play The Last of Us Part 2, despite the cavalcade of controversy and fiery rage that was directed at this title. Let's not beat around the spiked cock. The Last of Us Part 2 is a controversial game, whether due to some spoilers, which we'll get into later, the ultra-violence, accused pretentiousness, the act of LGBTQ characters just existing, the portrayal of a trans character, the overall story structure, and allegedly being misery porn. The Last of Us Part 2 has a diverse range of opinions on it. And personally, for me, I love The Last of Us Part 2. I love almost everything about it. The Last of Us Part 2 is great and doubles down on what made the first one so good. Tonally, it's bleak but not without heart and charm. While it is a sad and depressing tale about grief, vengeance, and the moral and personal cost thereof, there is plenty of happier character beats and themes that inform The Last of Us Part 2's grim world. It's dark, but not just for the sake of being dark. These characters have lost some semblance of happiness in their lives, and they're pissed about it. Anyone saying that this game is about violence and then taking a few moments to make you feel sad about the said violence is severely oversimplifying the narrative arcs and character beats in this game. I'll talk more about this in the spoiler section, but the game's story had me from start to finish. It's one of those games that I think about when I'm not even playing it. I won't get into plot specifics here, but I love the characters, particularly the spectrum of LGBTQ representation like Ellie and her girlfriend Dina. And let me just say that I adore Dina. Where most blockbuster games or movies allude to characters being queer, The Last of Us Part 2 puts lesbian protagonists and a trans character front and center. While there is debate on how well these characters are pulled off, I overall loved them. It was just really cool to see people like me in a popular form of genre fiction, and it's something that I want to see more of. Additionally, on the character front, I really related to the game's sympathetic and understandable antagonist. I won't spoil anything here, but she's a really damn good and complex character. The Last of Us Part 2's gameplay complements this somber tale. As a young adult Ellie, the player traverses Seattle in an open yet linear campaign where you fight various infected enemies and murder enemy combatants in vicious fashion. The combat is a perfect mixture of stealth and action. Naughty Dog has given the series some quality of life improvements, like the ability to go prone and to craft silencers, and in terms of action, the firefights are even more hectic than before. Enemies die in a more grim, realistic, gory fashion than in other games, and shout the names of their fallen comrades, which gives them a bit more of a human touch, making you feel slightly guilty when cutting enemies' throats, even though the combat is quite engaging and fun. Also, it's worth noting that enemies come in various backgrounds, ideological beliefs, races, and genders, and I just want to take a moment to point out that The Last of Us Part 2 is an equal opportunity killer. The Last of Us Part 2 is an enjoyable game to an extent. While the game focusing more on combat while also criticizing violence sounds like a contradiction, please let's not talk about business. The characters you play as revel in the violence they commit, and this bloodlust rubs off on the player. The message is that I'm having fun, but in a game that points out the catastrophic ramifications for committing violence, the narrative and gameplay informs us that what the characters, and by extension the player, do is fucked up. Enjoyment be damned. Admittedly, the game isn't subtle about this, but the funny thing about unsubtlety is that people still miss the fucking point all the time. The Last of Us Part 2 makes obvious statements about moral ambiguity in a kill or be killed world, and while the game is on the nose at times with its messaging, the irony of moral ambiguity is that it isn't very ambiguous. In reality, people coexist with ideological, personal, and background differences, yet so often in popular fiction, there is a clear dichotomy that separates the good and the evil, the heroes and the villains, and The Last of Us Part 2 is not in the wrong for hammering this point home. People complain that unsubtle messaging is a flaw, yet oftentimes, unsubtle themes are not bad just because they are obvious. Instead, unsubtle messaging can be bad because it contradicts the point of a given movie, video game, TV show, book, or medieval times brochure. In Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, Superman is compared to Jesus Christ over and over again, yet the titular Man of Steel's actions in that movie display a man who doesn't give two shits about innocent bystanders bystanders as Superman reenacts 9/11 times 1,000. It is jarring, and the action contradicts the film's intended thematic messaging. However, take The Matrix, another movie with an unsubtle Christ metaphor in the character of Neo. Like the version of Superman presented in Man of Steel, Neo is compared to Jesus in obvious fashion and also does collateral damage. Yet, the difference here is that Neo's actions are given in narrative context and justification. Where Superman's actions do not gel with Man of Steel's themes, Neo's actions are complementary to the themes of The Matrix, and The Last of Us Part 2 belongs in the latter Matrix-style category. Its message may be blunt, but it thematically walks the walk. It works. Now, let me address that this game is not for everyone. The Last of Us Part 2 is a subversion of both a post-apocalyptic zombie horror setting and another popular action subgenre that I'll get to when we discuss spoilers. But suffice to say, this game is often an unpleasant experience by design. While there is a certain satisfaction in participating in big action set pieces and dispatching a group of foes in calculating fashion, this game plays like a combination of a horror video game and a grim drama like No Country for Old Men. The action is exciting, but not without caveats that remind the player about the game's themes of violence, and how it makes the player complicit in that said violence. It's quite a line to walk, but The Last of Us Part 2 mostly does it well. But with that, I understand that this isn't everyone's cup of tea. The Last of Us Part 2 is often an unforgiving and bleak game. Sure, not as punishing, brutal, or torturous as Animal Crossing New Horizons, but close. The Last of Us Part 2 additionally has some other amazing attributes that I just adore. In terms of gameplay and presentation, The Last of Us Part 2 is an improvement over its predecessor. The crafting is even more intuitive, the upgrade systems keep reeling the player back in, environments, while linear, are bigger and explorable. There are quieter story-based moments that give the action some weight. The pulse-pounding soundtrack is terrific, the graphics and little details are great, the various enemy factions like the WLF and the Seraphites are awesome, and there are new types of infected to be terrified of, particularly a standout Resident Evil-inspired boss fight later in the game. All these things reeled me back in and kept me glued for the 26 hours of playtime. However, as much as I love this game, and let me be clear, I love this game, it's one of my favorites of the year so far, I would be remiss if I did not mention some aspects that I did not like as much. Most notably, the business practices. As the popular saying goes, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and this is especially true with games by Naughty Dog. Crunch, the act of workers laboring for excessive overtime hours with minimal breaks and off time to the detriment of employee health and morale, has been pervasive and severe in the studio for years, and The Last of Us Part 2 was no exception. Thanks to a report by Jason Schreier, we know about the toxic perfectionist environment at Naughty Dog that overall damages the health and well-being of workers. And make no mistake, this was a damning article. In an industry where this practice is already all too common, Naughty Dog's crunch is listed as being especially severe. If anything, the company is actively proud of it. And I don't care how much I enjoyed the game, this is a form of abuse, and no video game is worth it. Whether it's bad like Anthem or good like The Last of Us Part 2, not worth it. Just not. It's not. To sum up, The Last of Us Part 2 is a great game and a worthy successor to its classic predecessor. By itself, it's among my favorite games of this generation, and is also one of those rare games that I binged. I just had to keep playing and see where the story was going, and there were always new wrinkles to the gameplay that kept my attention. With that said, however, I cannot ignore the human cost that went into the production of The Last of Us Part 2, which in my eyes is the only real blemish of this game. While crunch has been normalized in this industry, see developers like BioWare, CD Projekt Red, 343 Industries, and Rockstar Games, that still does not excuse Naughty Dog's behavior here. Never mind the fact that I loved The Last of Us Part 2. When it comes to employee health, Naughty Dog and the rest of the video game industry needs to get its priorities straight. Period. So yeah, great game, one of my favorites of the year so far, but it just has some unsavory business practices that I just would do without. So now we're getting into spoilers. This is your last warning. Okay? Okay, you may have noticed that in the first half of this review, I did not mention any plot specifics, and that is because a major game-changing plot turn happens within the first couple hours. Joel, the flawed, brutal, yet sympathetic main character anti-hero of the last game, is tortured and murdered by 8 assailants led by a big buff-armed woman named Abby, and oh my god, those arms just confirm that I am a lesbian. But in an act of mercy, she and her friends leave Ellie alive. Yet, unfortunately, Ellie cannot forget this trauma, or forgive Abby for her actions. After a period of grieving, Ellie and her girlfriend Dina tracks these killers to Seattle, and from there, plot their revenge. Joel's death is controversial in the fan community, to say the least. Many people hated Joel's death, even going so far as to label his grisly murder as a form of shock value. But for me personally, I thought it was great. Joel had this amazing, emotional, heartbreaking arc in the first game, one that honestly can't be topped, and his death allows Ellie to grow as a character, a young out lesbian who is trying to figure out her place in the world while gripping with a devastating amount of grief and loss, and she's handling it poorly. While Joel still pops up in flashback sequences, his murder permeates every aspect of the game. Joel's death is devastating to be sure, but it also allows The Last of Us Part 2 to cover new ground with its characters, primarily Ellie, in the form of a revenge tale. In the backdrop of a zombie apocalypse setting, The Last of Us Part 2 is a revenge tale, and one that questions where the line should be drawn. Like, when does Ellie go too far? The Last of Us Part 2 is a genre deconstruction of this classic revenge fable that adds some new elements to the mix, especially where video game and movie blockbusters are concerned. Where most popular revenge stories like John Wick are told from the perspective of someone hyper-capable who is morally justified for the blood they spill, The Last of Us Part 2 questions how far is too far. Sure, Ellie's anger and trauma over losing Joel in brutal fashion is understandable, yet do the mounting corpses that Ellie leaves behind justify her need for vengeance? After all, as vicious as a man Joel was, he would never kill without reason. There was always an external objective motivating him. And despite Ellie convincing herself that vengeance is what Joel would want, honestly, Ellie is murdering people to dull her own emotional anguish. Over the course of the game, Ellie's moral transgressions keep becoming more and more uncomfortable. Even though I like her and I get her rage, she becomes more and more unhinged in her pursuit of vengeance. As the player, we're both horrified with what Ellie is doing, and we just kind of want her to stop. It's a really interesting dynamic between the player and the character. In broad terms, Ellie's journey in this game is a corruption arc. She needs closure for Joel's death no matter the cost, and make no mistake, she pays a steep price. Many of her friends are murdered and Dina dumps her at the end. In pursuit of revenge, Ellie loses damn near everything. It's heartbreaking in a good way and parallels the ramifications Abby suffers that result from her own pursuit of vengeance when killing Joel, which is an action that inadvertently leads to the deaths of Abby's friends, and is tragically poetic. Ellie's corruption arc is counterbalanced by Abby, who becomes a playable character in the second half of the game. Abby being playable midway through the story is controversial, but one that worked for me for two reasons. Firstly, Abby's plotline informs why Ellie's murder spree is wrong. Through Abby's flashbacks, we meet many of her friends that Ellie murders early on in the game, and learn that they are regular, relatable people who are just wearing enemy uniforms. And this gives context to why Ellie's actions earlier in the game are wrong. While Abby murdering Joel in grisly fashion is portrayed as villainous, Abby's reasoning is understandable. Abby's father was the surgeon for the Fireflies who was operating on Ellie before Joel gunned him down. And in a storytelling parallel, Abby went on the warpath to find Joel just like Ellie does for Abby. The circle of revenge! Secondly, Abby is sympathetic, partially due to her sexy muscular arms, but more importantly, her playable section shows her undergoing a redemption arc. Early on in her campaign, Abby meets two runaway kids escaping from the enemy faction known as the Seraphites, who are fundamentalist religious baddies that are the ideological equivalent of a violent Mike Huckabee. These kids save Abby's life, and in a bit of dramatic irony, the kids named Lev and Yara worm their way into Abby's cold dead heart, paralleling how Ellie thawed the moral freeze box known as Joel's six-pack in the first The Last of Us. Like how Joel betrayed the Fireflies at the end of the first game, Abby betrays her own faction, the WLF, in order to protect her new adopted family of Lev and Yara. And despite being the man she hated, Abby truly becomes Joel in the end. The Circle of Miller Time. Admittedly, Abby's arc contains a controversial element in that Lev, one of the children that Abby becomes a guardian of throughout her plotline, is a trans boy. While the character is voiced by a trans man named Ian Alexander, many people in the trans community have voiced their displeasure to the character. Whether due to how Lev is dead-named by enemies or discriminated against due to his gender identity, many a trans gamer have criticized the storyline as transgender trauma porn. Though personally speaking for myself, I loved Lev. Lev is a great character. He's strong, capable, and those who misgender him are portrayed as nearly irredeemable villains. So fuck him. While I understand that Lev's plotline might remind trans players of old wounds they would rather not deal with when playing a video game, for me, I thought it was cool to see someone like myself portrayed in a big budget AAA video game with a zombie apocalypse setting. Hell, as someone who had to endure a somewhat religious conservative upbringing where I had to fight for my identity tooth and estradiol pill, I strongly related to Lev's struggle and loved seeing a strong trans character in a big budget release. While I understand that this is a controversial take because many in my community view Lev as trans trauma porn, I fundamentally disagree. Lev is a very human character, and in a drama where everyone struggles no matter what race, religious background, sexuality, gender identity, or persona people have and are, Lev's plotline felt especially resonant. I really loved this character, and there is not anything in the game that prevents me from caring about his fate.
I don't like dogs.
Oh, never mind, he's dead to me now. Abby's redemption arc and Ellie's corruption arc come to a head in a brutal yet satisfying conclusion where Ellie shows mercy on Abby. The rationale for this act of high morality is due to the fact that Ellie remembered that she is capable of mercy, and revenge isn't something that Joel would want. While Ellie paid a heavy price in terms of how Dina left her, her friend Jesse is dead, and Tommy is maimed, Ellie finally learned to let go. It's a tear-jerkingly depressing finale, but one with an element of uplift. While Ellie loses everything, one thing that she earns is closure for Joel's death. It's beautiful, touching, and all around a heartfelt way to end the game. Admittedly, if there's a The Last of Us Part 3, I don't know where Naughty Dog will go from here, but whatever they do, I'm excited for the future. I really hope that we see more of Ellie, Abby, and Lev. In fact, Ellie could easily go through a more redeeming arc if there is a Part 3. But whatever Naughty Dog decides to do, I'm on board. The Last of Us Part 2 was a full and complete experience with a great story, terrific character beats, intense gameplay that improved from the original. The game had its hooks in me from start to finish, and it's an experience I will never forget. Despite all the odds against it, The Last of Us Part 2 is a sequel worthy of the original. Thank you so much for watching. And with that, I'd like to thank my high-tier patrons, particularly Slasher Vales, Mom, Miles Nelson, and David Devlin. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.